Howard Phillips Lovecraft, more commonly known as H.P. Lovecraft, is one of the pillars of horror fiction as we know it today. Lovecraft is most known for creating Cthulhu and its associated mythos, and although he died penniless at age 46, his work is now considered to be the foundation of a whole subgenre of horror. Lovecraftian horror deals with existential, cosmically unknowable frights. In his essay, Supernatural Horror in Literature, Lovecraft wrote, "The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear. And the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown." Lovecraft's stable of creatures and stories feature the aforementioned Cthulhu, mysterious colors that drive people mad, and miscegenation with fish people. Fun fact, he also had a cat. Given the creative names he gave his monsters, like Dagon the fish god, I'm sure he named his cat something fun.
Mamma mia!
Get Out is a bop. I'll keep it short because there's nothing that hasn't already been said about this movie since it came out in 2017. You've heard it all before. Get Out is a tightly plotted, old-school social thriller about new school American racism. It was a massive critical and commercial success, and it won this man a Best Original Screenplay award.
Now, today will not be a day off. In fact, today, you will work harder than...
It's a horror movie that critically examines the fetishization of black bodies, the hypocrisy of a post-racial America, and it does both while being consistently hilarious.
I believe they've been abducting black people, brainwashing them, making them work for them as sex slaves and shit. Oh, sorry about the shit. Sorry.
The movie's thesis, its secret ingredient, is best captured in its most sobering sequence, where lead character Chris makes his harrowing escape from the Armitage estate. After outsmarting and defeating every member of the body-snatching bourgeois family, a bloodied Chris stops his fatally injured girlfriend Rose, who, spoiler, is the main villain, from grabbing her rifle and killing him. He limps over to her, and after she briefly attempts to feign ignorance and innocence, Chris wraps his hands around her neck and starts to strangle her. Chris, and the audience, knows that Rose is a monster who would gladly continue her family's work if she had the opportunity. Chris's anger is completely justifiable, especially because we know now that Rose stole the lives of so many others. But Chris ultimately lets her go. She's gut-shot, bleeding out on the street, and Chris decides that she's better off dying alone. It's what she deserves. But before Chris can limp away, the sirens start. In any other horror movie, the arrival of the Popo means victory. It means the antagonist has finally been defeated. It means our survivors are about to be rescued. Here, a cop car represents the closest Chris's life has been to getting cut short in the entire movie. Over the next 20 seconds, the text of the film itself and the subtext it exists within crash together. Peele ends up taking his foot off the gas and letting Chris be saved. But that was not the original vision for how the film would end. Peele's original intention was for Chris to have killed Rose before being arrested and put in prison.
The idea here is he's been through such mental shock and torment, and the house and everything, all the evidence is burnt down. And of course, this is a system that values the rich white people and takes their side. So, my feeling is what would happen in this movie is Chris would end up in jail just because of how it looks.
Get Out's original ending is what would really happen, but that doesn't make it the superior version just because it plays closer to our reality. Chris's arc, and the movie as a whole, says something about American racism by not having Chris's suffering be the central spectacle. Instead, the targets of Peele's satire, white liberals who fetishize blackness, fail spectacularly in their goals because they fail to see black people like Chris as human beings.
I would have voted for Obama for a third term if I could. Best president in my lifetime, hands down.
In the original ending, Chris's struggle against his literal dehumanization lands him in prison, where the degradation of his humanity would continue. In the final ending, he is victorious over white liberal racism and he escapes martyrdom. In this clash of horror movie cliche and the reality of police brutality, Chris transcends his promised fate. To me, this last scene of Get Out is exactly why it had such a massive impact. Lord knows it's not because the targets of its satire got the joke. So Get Out is a runaway success, quickly becoming one of the biggest horror movies of all time. The movie came out at the peak of conversations about black artists getting their due, and studios hungry for the next big horror hit have done everything they can to siphon some of that goodwill. They figure that if you put "from the producers of Get Out" on the poster, it might as well be the Nintendo seal of quality. Butts end up in seats, even if the producers in question are these guys and the movie is this. We'll get back to this. The way I see it, Get Out's success has had two consequences. Firstly, it opened up the themes and styling of black genre to mainstream scrutiny. And two, it limited those themes to what was seen in Get Out, namely, filtering racism through horror tropes. I think there's a popular misconception now that Get Out created a genre, mostly from non-black people, and that's just not true. Black genre, or fantasy, sci-fi, and horror media about or by black people, has a long history. You may have heard of author Octavia Butler's sci-fi work, and there are several black horror films from across the decades. You've got Ganja and Hess, Sugar Hill, Candyman, Eve's Bayou, Blackula. Everything that makes Get Out work as a good black genre movie is seen in its climax. There are real social issues happening in fantastical circumstances, and our characters resolve their personal trauma, their arcs, in a satisfying way. What makes the movie immortal is that the completion of this arc also feels like a victory for black audiences, who really needed to see one when the movie was released. I know I did. Look, I'm sure a lot of you know this already. Get Out came out 4 years ago, almost to the day. But I think we have to talk about why Get Out works, the specificity of its themes, its writing, and the climate it was released in, to understand why Lovecraft Country doesn't quite come together in the same way.
So what's all this got to do with her? Go on, tell me. Get your ass up! We gotta get the fuck out of here now!
Lovecraft Country, according to HBO's official synopsis, follows Atticus Freeman as he joins up with his friend Letitia and his uncle George to embark on a road trip across 1950s Jim Crow America in search of his missing father. This begins a struggle to survive and overcome both the racist terrors of white America and the terrifying monsters that could be ripped from a Lovecraft paperback. Spoilers, but the first half of this synopsis really only applies to the plot of the first 2 episodes, if that. Atticus finds his father by the end of episode 2. The rest of the show's 8 episodes can be more accurately summed up by the second half of the synopsis. The struggle to survive and overcome both the racist terrors of white America and the terrifying monsters that could be ripped from a Lovecraft paperback. Funnily enough, the most notable monster taken from Lovecraft's work and put into the show is his virulent racism. While H.P. Lovecraft is well known as one of the greatest writers in horror, he was also a vicious racist who articulated his fear of the foreign into stories about incomprehensible monsters like Cthulhu and the aforementioned miscegenation with fish people. Like Get Out, showrunner Misha Green sets up racism as the antagonistic undercurrent of her story, but her scope goes even wider. In interviews about the show, Green says that she's so drawn to horror because the idea of being an other in this world is that you're always walking around in a horror movie at all times. I've always lived in a horror movie. On a metatextual level, it wouldn't be inaccurate to say that the villain of Lovecraft Country as a production is the specter of Lovecraft himself. As such, the show inverts Lovecraft's vision of horror by having the outsiders he feared be the heroes, and having them face not just monsters of his own creation, but the monstrous bigotry that he lived with. This combination made watching the pilot the most fun I had watching a TV episode in 2020. And I watched a lot of TV. The climax of this episode takes the climax of Get Out and gives it even higher stakes. Our heroes barely escape a sundown town, but then they're captured by the police, and then right before the cops kill them, bam, monsters show up. Real history and monster movie chaos comes together, and
Baby, you got a stew going.
the fact that our main characters are black makes it that much more intense, because we know the fantastical stakes, the bloodthirsty monsters out to kill them, and the more mundane ones, the Shoggoths. And like Chris's victory in Get Out, their victory feels cathartic. They beat 2 kinds of monsters, and in this moment, the show is both transcendent television and a resonant reflection of the dangers of being black in America, then and now. Man, that first episode is so good. I mean, do I really have a problem with this show? Well, yeah, because it becomes something completely different after the first 2 episodes. Okay, confession time. When I watched trailers for Lovecraft Country and found out it was adapted from a book, I really thought it was just supposed to be the Black Game of Thrones. No, not that one. I knew nothing about the book, and I just knew that Peele was producing, it was going to be a big budget sci-fi show starring black people, and that sounded fun to me. And because I thought it was going to be more like Game of Thrones, I was surprised to find the main storyline of season 1 is pretty understated. Instead, the show is more of an anthology, with each episode after the second one focusing on a member or associate of the Freeman family and the new sci-fi shenanigans that have come to fuck up their lives. Some of the best episodes of the show work almost as standalone short films. You have Uncle George's wife Hippolyta discovering herself in an Afro-futuristic time warp, Letty battling ghosts in a boarding house she sets up for black Chicagoans, and a love story starring a fox demon during the Korean War. It's an ambitious move, and I applaud Green for taking the risk. But as with all risk, it doesn't always pay off. If Get Out's strength is the specificity of its themes, the fetishization of black people, the lie of post-racism, Lovecraft Country's weakness is that it tries to be too many things at once, and creates some weird implications as a result. A great case study of this issue, and others that I have with this show, is Jigabobo, the 8th episode of the show. Jigabobo highlights 3 season-long storylines that each use magic as a means to discuss how trauma, race, and power interact. First, there's this episode's point of view character, Dee, the youngest member of the Freeman clan, daughter of Uncle George and Hippolyta. At this point in the show, her mother's just disappeared, and she's the only one who doesn't know about magic. On top of that, her best friend was just murdered in one of the most traumatic moments of the early civil rights movement, the lynching of Emmett Till, or Bobo, as his friends called him.
Lying. She has to know about Bobo. She come back.
Will be soon.
Stop fucking lying to me! You're all lying to me!
Hey.
Dee ends up being cursed by two cops aligned with the Sons of Adam, a white supremacist cult of wizards who seek immortality and are the primary antagonists of the show. The conditions of the curse has Dee haunted by two demons that represent Topsy from Uncle Tom's Cabin, who do a bunch of really creepy dances and chase Dee throughout the city. Only Dee can see them, and every time they catch up with her, her breath catches in her throat. She struggles to say, "I can't breathe." The parallel is as harrowing as it is uncomfortable to watch. Everywhere Dee goes, she begs for help, but all the adults ignore her. They can't see what's haunting her. This alignment of the fictional reality of the show and the long history of police brutality that faces Black people made me wonder if there's an upper limit to building upon the ideas laid out in Get Out's climax. At what point does watching this become an act of sadomasochism for Black viewers? By the time help arrives for Dee, it's too late. This episode also returns to Ruby, Letty's older sister. Her storyline is fixated on the idea of passing and the barriers to her achieving her aspirations that she is constantly denied as a large, dark-skinned woman. When she's offered a potion that allows her to transform into a petite white woman earlier in the season, she takes it. By episode 8, Ruby feels torn between her grief over Emmett's murder and her growing entanglement with Christina, heiress to the Sons of Adam and the one who gave her the potion in the first place. Having a character literally shift between the black and white worlds of 1950s America could be a show in itself. And I wish the writing gave more to Ruby to shine as a complex character on the same level as the rest of the cast.
Ma'am, you okay?
What did you do to her, boy?
I was just trying to help.
It's okay, man. He can't hurt you anymore. You're safe now.
Get over there.
One of the most impactful scenes in her starring episode is when she quits her job. A scene I won't go into further detail on because it's rather graphic and I think would be triggering for some viewers. Without going into detail, I'll just say that it wasn't nearly as satisfying a climax for her episode as I think the writers wanted it to be, and I found it pretty unnecessary, since it doesn't really inform her character after the fact. That's a damn shame, because Wumi Mosaku kills it in this show, and I wish the writers spent more time with her and her character. The third plotline and character I want to discuss in Jigabobo is our villain, Christina. Christina's science fiction hook is that she's white. Capital W. I'm joking, but I'm not. Her race and her magic makes her socially and literally invulnerable.
Tick, really, you have to be smarter than this. You know you can't just go around killing white women.
And she can't imagine herself as a racialized being as a result. Her inability to understand Ruby's grief at Emmett's funeral leads to one of the coldest mic drops in the whole show.
I don't care about Emmett Till. I don't care about Roy Bryant or J.W. Milam, who'll never see justice for what they did. I don't care that half this city's on the brink because of it, and I don't think that you really do either.
While I first took that to be an indictment of Ruby's selfishness, it's also a look into Christina's own apathy to the bigotry that we've seen traumatize every other character in the show. Despite knowing magic spells that make her unable to be harmed, she still wants more. In her mind, Christina ultimately bears no ill will to the Freemans. But like the villains of Get Out, she's ultimately concerned with protecting and consuming the body of the main character in order to ensure her own immortality. In multiple interviews with Misha Green and the cast of the show, trauma is laid out as the thematic thread that ties the story of the Freemans together. But I question the utility of graphic displays of violence against Black people when the language of B-movies is used to explain it. How violence is used throughout the show is unsettling, and not always in the ways that Green intends it to be. While the show was clearly set in a past where open bigotry was the norm, the on-screen murder of a two-spirit person as a plot device was incredibly unnecessary and cruel. And having the perpetrator be a closeted gay man who hates himself is also a choice. At the end of the day, creatives can make whatever decisions they want. But is there a line between a meaningful examination of Black trauma and exploitative indulgence that serves no one? Yes, and it's called Antebellum. Antebellum is not a bop. Janelle Monáe is great, love her, but she really needs to fire her agent and pick better scripts. This is a huge downgrade from Moonlight. You know, Lovecraft Country's trailers disguise the show's structure, but I mostly got what it told me it was going to be. Antebellum's promotional material is a straight up lie. Remember those producers I talked about who also produced Get Out? Well, they're here, but neither of them are Jordan Peele. On top of that, the trailers are edited to imply a time travel element that isn't actually in the movie. Now this really sucks because I thought the movie was going to be a stealth adaptation of Kindred, an Octavia Butler novel about a woman who's repeatedly yanked from her modern life and into the antebellum South. That book never shies away from the graphic horrors of slavery, but every awful thing that happens in the book is instructive. It tells you more about Butler's perspective on race, gender, and violence across eras. The opposite of an instructive use of violence is an exploitative one, where the burden of giving it meaning falls on the audience. It's shocking, but ultimately empty, and that is the entirety of Antebellum's opening act. The movie starts with an unbroken series of sequences where enslaved people are whipped and murdered, unbroken by any plot developments or even a spoken line from a Black character. The characters, in fact, barely exist. The story and the twist it sets up is stupid and poorly implemented, and the whole thing is just painful to watch. This video was originally supposed to be an analysis of Get Out, Lovecraft Country, and this movie. But Antebellum pissed me off so much I couldn't stomach finishing it, at least not in one sitting. The directors apparently based the movie off a nightmare one of them had, which doesn't surprise me in the slightest, because the movie is nonsensical suffering that has nothing to say if you give it any thought after it's over. Sadia Hartman talks about how she doesn't focus on what she calls the terrible spectacles of slave literature, because she worries about the ease with which such scenes are usually reiterated, the casualness with which they are circulated, and the consequences of the routine display of the slave's ravaged body. Instead, she seeks to highlight the terrors of slavery that are less visible. I have chosen to look elsewhere and consider those scenes in which terror can hardly be discerned. Slaves dancing in the quarters, the outrageous darky antics of the minstrel stage, the constitution of humanity in slave law, and the fashioning of the self-possessed individual. By defamiliarizing the familiar, I hope to illuminate the terror of the mundane and quotidian, rather than exploit the shocking spectacle. Antebellum indulges in this hyperfixation on spectacular violence against Black people in popular culture, a tendency that diverts our attention from the quiet violence that persists in our present, violence that we are conditioned to accept as the norm. Shock value is pretty worthless after the first few times, and after the brutal summer of 2020, it's clear how quickly the US suppresses protest after the state-backed murder of Black people comes to light. The suffering becomes the norm, the expectation, and this limits the imagination of Black people to that of perpetual martyrs and mourners as opposed to fully human beings. And you know, the thing is, I get why people like the movie. If you did, that's fine, really. I don't make videos to try and make anyone think how I think. But Antebellum made me question why we indulge in the terrible spectacle of black trauma in entertainment. In the last few years, roughly between 12 Years a Slave and the Oscar So White campaign, there was a lot of talk about why there should be no more slave movies. Now, these movies exist for a reason. I want to go so far as to say they shouldn't exist at all. But there is a growing tension between the homogeneity of black media that would most likely receive mainstream attention and recognition and the actual diversity of black artists' output. Why are movies about black trauma the ones that consistently win critical favor? Is the suffering of black people across time and space instructive for its non-black audience? Or is it just meant for consumption? Food for thought with empty calories.
Is there something about Green Book that offends you? This is what I'm trying to get to.
Offend? Are you British?
Yeah.
Are you British?
I am.
Let me give you a British answer. It was my cup of tea. Not my cup of tea!
Now, to be fair, directors can't control when things get released, and historical context can have a big effect on how we consume media. Get Out came out at the tail end of the Obama administration, during a transition from the post-racial lie to a more openly racist political landscape. By no fault of their creators, Lovecraft Country and Antebellum arrived years later, during a summer of global protests against the anti-black colonial state, where footage of murdered black people dominated everyone's feeds as we began an ongoing period of isolation. Lovecraft Country has to reconcile its everything in the kitchen sink approach to black history with the fact that it's a big budget TV show on HBO that people need to tweet about. And I don't envy Misha Green for having to thread that needle. But I do think one of her attempts to have it both ways is the ultimate display of the show's issues. Near the end of Jigabobo, Christina has an uncharacteristic realization that she does want to try and understand why Ruby cares so much about Emmett's murder and the death of other black people. So she goes to the docks and pays 2 men to kill her in the exact same way that Emmett Till was murdered. Her invulnerability means her body will regenerate, but she imagines that living his final moments will deepen her empathy. And so the show depicts the entire act on camera without cuts. I don't know if I need to say this, but this is deeply fucked up on a number of levels. But the most significant to me is that we never see Emmett's actual murder in the show. He pops up as a background character a few times in the first few episodes and talks about his fateful trip down south in his final appearance, right before he leaves. Not showing the savage lynching of a child is a good move. It's not that I want to see him die, but then why depict it at all? You have characters reenact real trauma and real pain in lurid detail, all to become an immortal media franchise, to become a pillar of HBO's prestige television lineup. But what does Lovecraft Country want to say? A huge part of Lovecraft Country's lore is based on the idea that magic is real, although it varies by region. For example, the Sons of Adam are a secret society of white supremacist wizards whose magic system is tied to the book of Genesis in the Bible, while Jia is a Korean fox spirit inside a human vessel. While the various members of the show's cast encounter some level of magic or science fiction tech over the course of the season, the initial reason that the Freeman family have access to magic at all is because the founder of the aforementioned cult was a slave master who raped main character Atticus's ancestor. Now, this didn't make much sense to me at first. If every kind of magic differs across the planet, why is it that there's only one line of black magicians, and that their power is only granted to them because their ancestors were raped by white men? I think the only way to interpret this decision is to think of magic as an allegory for power and domination. The show begins with white racists having a monopoly on violence, both magical and mundane. And I think the writer's goal was to subvert this in the season finale. Letty creates a spell that explicitly strips the ability to use magic from white people.
Not just you. Every white person in the world. Magic is ours now.
Now this twist could have been set up earlier in the season, but I think it works especially well because magic is supposed to be an allegory for power, for invulnerability.
My father's claim to fame was invulnerability. He thought if you couldn't be harmed, you'd live forever.
The first season of Lovecraft Country begins in our reality, where Black people are distinctly vulnerable, not safe, protected, or valued. And in the end, the season concludes with a fundamental shift in power away from our rapists, murderers, and abusers. Like Get Out's theatrical ending, our heroes get to win, but this time it's bigger than beating one evil white woman and her family's twisted legacy. It's a societal reset that hopefully protects our characters from the twin beast of cosmic horror and white supremacy. I've come to accept that Lovecraft Country's depiction of trauma, like its recreation of Emmett's murder on a white woman's body, is a copy of a copy, an echo of real pain and not quite the reflection of our history that it wants to be. The gore and violence is provocative, as expected for HBO's next big hit, but it's difficult to tell what the show's more provocative scenes are in service of thematically. To be fair, maybe they don't have to be in service of anything. But each episode is stuffed with references to photographs, writing, poetry, and music from the Jim Crow era that was clearly researched and labored over. So it's strange to me that its references to the racism, homophobia, and vicious violence of the era ends up feeling so two-dimensional. If the awful things that happen to them are supposed to serve the characters, their trauma isn't always given the attention it needs to explain why they are who they are at the end of the season. For example, unlike in Get Out, I have no idea why Dee chokes and murders Christina, a woman who is already dying a miserable death. Yes, Christina is trash and murdered her cousin, but Dee has never met her, and we had already assumed Christina was dead before this scene. If Christina had to be killed by a main character, then just about any other character in the cast besides Dee has a bigger bone to pick with her. It feels gratuitous when a character with no connection to the villain brutally murders her, especially when it's a child. If the terrible spectacles are supposed to be a stirring reflection on America's history, then having a scene where the lynching of a black boy is recreated on a white woman is an incredibly poor taste. Lovecraft Country is caught up in a contradiction, where it wants to be an entertaining genre show and a sober reflection on the Black American reality. It's an ambitious, beautiful, and often very entertaining fantasy show about family secrets, power, and trauma. But as a work of Black genre that exists alongside classics that examine Black trauma more fruitfully, the culmination of its text and its subtext falls short. I hope that if there is more, it has tighter plotting and commits to deeper examination of its characters. More importantly, I hope the show makes better use of the terrible spectacles that exist within Black life. Genre fiction can be a potent commentary on our reality, and I want to see the fight against monsters continue. I just hope our next visit to Lovecraft Country tells more stories about Black humanity instead of just Black death.
And how you're going to communicate to the vast, heedless, unthinking, cruel white majority that you are here. I'm terrified at the moral apathy, the death of the heart, which is happening in my country. These people have deluded themselves for so long that they really don't think I'm human. I base this on their conduct, not on what they say. And this means that they have become, in themselves, moral monsters.
Won't pay you something for nothing. There's so much bluffing.
Hey guys, Unscripted Shane here. Thank you for watching. This video has been easily like the last 4 or 5 weeks of my life, and I'm really proud of it. I'm happy I was able to get it out here, and I'm glad that you came by to watch it. I'm really excited to make a lot more projects this year. If analyzing anime through the lens of slave narrative sounds interesting to you, or you want to see me talk a ton of shit about an old after school special about Martin Luther King Jr., among a huge number of other things, that's something I want to get done for Black History Month. So hope you stick around, like and subscribe. See you next time.